Yeah. Well,
okay. So I think the rule today is no AI. We are AI'd out.
Yeah. AI fatigue, I think, has set in.
Despite everything that's happening with it, let's see whether we can do this. Can we be disciplined?
The question, I'm also just looking at the clock. I started it when we hit record. I'm like, how long before one of us breaks it? Who's it going to be? I have a feeling it might be me.
Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's been crazy because I think trying to think about not using AI or not talking about it specifically is, I mean, I'm almost questioning. I'm like, I don't even know if we can do it.
Let's see.
I mean, because I'm just sitting here.
Okay, challenge accepted.
I'm tempted to break the rule right now.
No. Sean, do not.
Oh my goodness.
What's going on which is not AI, but which is cool and interesting?
What? That's a really good question.
I know.
Well, let me throw out a more philosophical question then.
Yes.
We can tackle it and we can do our best to awkwardly stay away from
it
invoking.
up and then we can get into it.
So all right, even when I set this up, it'll be kind of hard to not evoke AI, okay?
We're going to have the swear box here, by the way. Every time you mention it, you're going to have a ka-chink.
This deck has like a bleep button, somewhere could figure out how to use it. So more specifically, or more broadly, I should say, on technology.
Yes.
Was thinking, and I find myself often, as of late, has built up to the fatigue of just all these things, right? And I think there's a cyclical nature of when we have new technologies sort of hit, there is this, we have hype cycles for a reason, right? I mean, these are cyclical in the way that they work in many ways. They come, they go. We have bubbles, we have bursts, we have summers and springs and winters, and all these kind of things. But one of the question that I've sort of been coming back to, or at least I was really thinking about it last night, and then it persisted this morning, was going all the way back to some old literature. So end of the 19th century.
Yep.
I'm not evoking H.G. Wells this time.
I was just about to say, is this another H.G. Wells?
Although, it might have, you definitely can bring that in because I return. The point I'm coming back to is Oscar Wilde's very famous quote about life imitating art as opposed to art imitating life.
Right, yes.
And that conversation is a wonderful one to have. Again, it's a great sort of conversational essay piece that goes back and forth. But, and kind of outlaying that too for people who aren't familiar. I'll link obviously it's in public domain now because, but so I'll link the full essay there so you can see it. But essentially, this back and forth of does art imitate life or does life imitate art?
Yes.
And sort of this argument back and forth.
Right. Of course, the answer is yes, by the way. Both.
Exactly. The true answer is just yes.
Right, yes.
But one of the things that it really got me thinking about is, I think one of the, and this all comes from, again, this idea of again, thinking about the story that art can play, right?
Yes,
so when you say, why would life imitate art? Well, the argument against some of that realism is that life by itself is mundane and boring. And it's only when we bring our context or our framing or our storytelling to it, does it become interesting.
Well, as well, you've got this idea that story defines who we are and what we do. And then the question is, where does that story come from? And a lot of that leads back to art.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe, let's take a break right here.
Okay.
We'll actually open the show because I want to ask you a deeper question about this exact
shortest cold open ever. Go for it.
Because I'm scared of evoking AI unintentionally.
Okay.
Initializing waveform.
Modulating signals for transmission.
Exploring the possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Welcome to Modem Futura. All right, so welcome to Modem Futura, the podcast that explores the possible, probable, and preferable futures sitting at the intersection of technology and society. And I'm Sean Leahy here with
Andrew Maynard.
And we are having our AI fatigue day.
Yes.
It's like the reverse of like a cheat meal or something, where it's like, this is the one day we're not going to talk about AI, or we're just going to try our best not to.
Yep.
And during this, the smallest cold open that I could think to do, we sort of evoked Oscar Wilde's quote, which comes from The Decay of Lying, which is the title of the essay. And I pulled it up here also just to make sure I got the date right. It was published in 1889.
Okay.
So going back there, but again, kind of bringing up this idea of, again, is it the story and what story is being told? But then when it comes to, again, thinking about that in relation to the technological advancement that we've been through, that we're living in now.
Right.
Again, we're in fatigue for a reason.
Yes.
One of the things that really kind of brought me back, and part of this was our conversation with Mark Daly when we were talking around this kind of came up, and this has sort of bled into this conversation, or at least in my thinking of it, was when we think about that story. And then I was starting to think about, but whose story exactly here?
Who's telling it? Where is it coming from?
Who's telling it? And how, then even starting to question, because originally then you're like, well, it's my story, of course. But then I'm like, well, what is my story? And
who's influenced it?
Who's influencing that?
Yeah.
And then very quickly, that kind of led me down this but also simultaneously, it led me down this pathway of questioning, which, for me, this is always a healthy sort of critical view I always have when I'm like, wait a minute. I think I've talked about my defense against the reality distortion field of new technology products. Haven't I?
I can't remember, but bring it in again.
So I have. So it's one of these.
It sounds a little bit like Defense Against the Dark Arts.
Well, it maybe is both that and a defense for my bank account, perhaps. But so I would say it's a strength I have recognizes the weakness I have for the excitement over these new.
Your superpower is resisting the irresistible lure of new technologies that are impacting your bank account.
That's exactly it. And so, the easiest.
I do not understand this. I do not suffer from this whatsoever, as I'm sure my wife will testify.
Nope, nothing, no problem there. But the easiest way for me maybe to explain it is. People can debate all they want here or there, but I think I will argue that nobody over the last 20 years has done product announcements or launches the way Apple has done them in terms of they announce a product and creating this almost insatiable, I almost will use the term lust to get that object because, and that's a testament, of course, to not only the engineering of the product and whatever.
And of course, this is what Steve Jobs did. And he had this philosophy of creating the market. He didn't work out what people wanted. He told people what they wanted. And created and design. And that's where, some of the, especially the early, I think, just genius that came out of them in terms of the product development was sort of making a thing that acted like their philosophical point was a bicycle for the mind, right? They gave you this tool. They weren't going to, they wanted to empower you to do it, but show you this amazing, so what I've allowed myself, right, is when you have these moments, it's like, I get wrapped up. It's hard not to. You get wrapped up and you're like, yes, I need that. Yes.
Because they do such a good job of just slowly like boiling the world that you're in where you're like, yep, I can see how that would it'd be embarrassing to like do an inventory of the items that I'm like, yep, that's from that keynote. That's from this keynote.
Right.
But I allow myself to get all excited, and then I have a self-imposed like 1 week wait time.
Okay,
because it takes takes about several days for that excitement to sort of calm down, and then start going. Do I really? Is this really a problem that I need? That this is a solution for me?
Right.
And so I have that against these products. Otherwise, like I said, I would be broke because I would just I would get wrapped up in everything, and I know a lot of people in our world probably share this. We all have that closet or drawer or garage.
The things you bought that you never use.
Right. The museum to technology innovation, right?
Yes. And I don't think it's just new technologies. There's this thing about just getting this desire for something that you're absolutely sure you need,
Yep.
even though you don't. And,
Yep.
and I love this idea of having the cooling off period.
Yep. And I've learned professionally too. I mean, I've had the luxury of this as well is, new cameras. Oh, if I only had that new camera,
Right.
it would be so much better. And then, you get your hands on, some of the absolute top of the line equipment and you use it and you're like, well, yes, it is amazing. But I'm like, did it change?
That's right. Yeah. I've got to ask you here. So even with the cooling off period, have you had instances where you've bought the latest shiny thing that you know is going to be incredible and you've been disappointed?
Not recently. Not since I've put up that original guard wall. I'm like, and one of the things, speaking of Apple, this goes all the way back to the original iPhone. I remember waiting in line for this thing,
yes,
right?
yep.
Got it. And then it was not long after they issued like a refund or a partial refund or partial credit because they were like, oh, it was too expensive. And so they were like, and it was one of those moments where I was like, dang, like I got burned as an early, an early adopter.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say, as I'm speaking of this, there was one instance and it was with a video game. It wasn't like a hardware technology. And I fell victim, as many people did, with the original launch of this game called Cyberpunk 2077.
Okay.
Utterly broken, didn't work, like absolute garbage. And they've patched it all now and it works. And a lot of people actually really enjoy the game.
Yep.
I refuse to play it because I got burned and I still have it. And I'm like, that is on my shelf.
Went sour.
Yep. As a reminder of sometimes being an early adopter, it comes back to bite.
But it's funny. We should probably steer this back to sort of the stories and that connection with art. But it's also funny. I have deep nostalgia for some of the things I've purchased, usually in a work context, that really weren't up to the job. But I still love them. So the thing that I hanker after most is the Apple Newton. I don't know whether you remember this. End of the 1990s.
Yes. Never had one though.
The tablet with handwriting recognition. Yep. And I purchased one. I tried to use it for probably a year or so. I loved that device. Utterly dysfunctional.
Yep.
But I still wish I had it. The design was beautiful. The functionality was lousy.
I think I feel like I may have mentioned this before, but I had like early in the PDA, portable. What does the PDA even stand for? I've forgotten all.
Portable digital assistant.
Portable digital or pocket digital assistant. Yeah. Portable, yeah. I had a compact version. It was like the compact iPack, I think it was called.
Yep.
And it had this little like flip, like translucent screen that you would flip over and had a stylus. Yeah. Same thing. I love that. What was I doing with it? Right. I mean, to be honest, I think in the end, I was trying to get like Super Mario emulated on it, which it wouldn't allow for multiple inputs simultaneously. Right. You can't play video games where you can't run and jump. You're like, that's,
you have to choose between them.
Yeah, which right away, that's a deal breaker on almost all platform games where you can't run and jump.
I'm wondering whether people listening to this, you've got about 20% of them who are saying, that's me. I'm there. Yeah. You're channeling me. And 80% thinking, you must be out of your minds.
You idiots. What are you doing? The funny thing is I still have that. I need to go I need to go dig it up.
So what do you do with these things though? They just end up in the museum of...
They do. Well, here's another one. I've never either discarded, sold, or otherwise gotten rid of any video game console I've ever owned.
Really?
Yep. Yep. And I was late to the game. I wasn't allowed to have video games as a child. My parents,
Yep. I know.
I see how well that worked out for you, mom and dad. House is full of them now. Yep. No, but yeah, I refuse to get rid of all those things. And it's partially for nostalgia, one. Yep. And also, I think keeping those items also for me in many ways is a testament to the technology that they represent and where we were in the advancements and also all the things that come with them as part of this bigger sort of landscape of where we're moving with things. And so for me, there's always, even just from also from an industrial design perspective, like a lot of the things I like because aesthetically, they bring me joy to see them.
And that's important. And I just bring it back to this idea of story. What really fascinates me here is you've got this narrative that somebody else has set. Somebody else has created this story that gets into your mind and makes you think, I've got to have this as part of my life.
Yeah.
But then it becomes your story.
Yeah.
You actually sort of begin to co-opt this and develop it. So now you look back and all of those devices, which I'm sure you can't do anything with these days, but there's still something there, that the fact that they bring you joy and they've got some part in the story of your life, I think is intriguing. So it shows that it's not just external manipulation in terms of who tells the story, but this is a co-creation process between us and the people who are generating those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And what the affect is of those, whether it be the item itself or for a lot of technology, like, I'll say like video games, right? Especially in the earlier days. So like in the late 80s, 90s, all the way up until like the early 2000s, before sort of internet-based, multiplayer, they were also hubs of community, because you would invite your friends over and everyone would, you'd scramble or fight for the controllers.
Yes.
And so it would it was also this representation of not just your own story, but how your story intersects with with your community.
Becomes part of a community. Yes.
And then we all got headsets and start screaming at each other, and which is a bizarre thing.
Yeah, but what I love about this is it is so easy to fall into the trap of assuming that there is some sort of big organization or corporation that is manipulating us through market forces or whatever, persuading us, forcing us to align with their story by buying things.
Yeah.
Life is way messier than that. Oh,
yeah,
yes.
It's way messier.
You do have these big corporations that are trying to do this, but it's almost like sort of life will out in terms of sort of the stories we tell ourselves. You can't completely constrain our own individual and community stories.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, because that's one of the things too. So kind of bringing this back to where I think I don't even know how I got on the train of this of my.
But it's life. It's what it's life and art and that intersection and those stories.
And so one of the things as that relates to my defense against the dark arts of the reality distortion field, is having this.
Your story buffer, by the way.
That's right, my story buffer. It's like my wall, right? It's my force field.
Yes.
But it is. And during that time, I ask myself these critical questions. Like, do I really need that? Or is this just, I want it?
Right.
And why do I want it? Like, will that object bring me joy? Because I've been fortunate enough to have that experience where you get that thing you thought was going to change everything. And it's usually been professionally. So it hasn't been like my fortune that's been spent on it. But then you get this thing, you're like, oh yeah, it's cool, but it didn't change who I am. It didn't have this transformational power. Yeah. So therefore it's just a thing. And it may have some affordances that other things don't, but that's you can measure that piece. So I've had that fortunate ability to kind of sit through that. So that's what I do with myself.
Yep.
And the same is true with the things that are happening like around us. When a new, again, I'm trying not to evoke the AI thing here, but whether a new technology, a new tool comes on the scene, there's all this hype around it. And it's the same thing. It's like, is this just hype? Is this just, people are familiar with me on this podcast talking about, again, cutting through the hype and trying to dissect the hype from the realities, fighting against that sort of that tidal wave of mythic, assignment to these things. But not talking about AI specifically, because I'm trying not to do that, but talking about it in general today as why some of the things that when we were thinking about this, like, can we do an episode where we don't talk about AI? And we're going to not talk about it directly, but it's on the peripheral, because that was one of the things that I was noticing too when I think about this story, is there's almost no place I can go digitally in my digital workflow that no longer has that doesn't at present have some tie into an artificial intelligent platform or system.
Yep. It's becoming ubiquitous.
So much the fact that I opened Microsoft Word yesterday doing revisions on something, and right away I got the box saying, anytime you open So I'm not even opting in. Anytime you open a Word file, now don't worry, Copilot will automatically generate a summary for you.
Right. But it
didn't ask for that.
And I'm not sure whether Word does this. I get to go into this and then I'm going to get away from AI. But it's so many platforms now.
Get away from
you
Word.
Start off with a blank sheet and you've got that button that says, do you want AI to start populating it? I don't understand that. You open an email to send to somebody, and the first thing you have before you've even written a word is, do you want AI to help you write this?
Gotta get it. Yeah. And it's crazy. And so, in its social media platform, same thing. You go to something,
But this is very much a case of somebody else controlling the narrative.
And that's it.
And it feels... in part as if the story is being written for us with AI and all these technologies. So then the question is our whole approach to this being informed by somebody else's story, or are we able to break out of it? And I'm going to put a placeholder there because I actually think that that's something for another episode, because it's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you translate it to other technologies or even art, because I think there's a really interesting connection here. Who is controlling the narrative? Are you just a subject, an NPC in this narrative? Or are you in some way in control of the narrative? And are you generatively forming a new story through these interactions?
Yeah. And that's a hard, I think about that. If I were to try to answer that as an artist, right? How would I? And then again, this evokes that thing of like, wait a minute. If I look back and try to pull these things apart of where did the sort of DNA, if you will, come from that I'm thinking this way or that I'm producing something this way? Is that really an original thought of mine? Or, you can all say in postmodernism, there is nothing original. Everything is built on something that came before. Sure. However, in that context, is it still something that I thought of based on like, am I sure of the roots of my own idea or my own story?
Yes.
And the thing that I'm struggling with right now is I'm starting to question how much of that identity is truly mine.
Right.
I think you've expressed this before when talking about using an AI for writing like that, because that is that's the place you're holding out with that.
That's right.
That platform, right?
Except I've just gone and broken that rule, but yes.
Okay. Rules are meant to be broken, right? But I'm starting to question this a lot because again, when I was sitting here thinking, maybe that's just, again, the result of fatigue as you start thinking about these things and going, but I was chasing this idea down, and I remember an article by Kashmir Hill. This would have been, 5 years ago, somewhere in there. I'll dig it up and put it in the show notes. But she went on an experiment to try to cut the big 5 technology companies out of her life for a week or something like that.
Right.
And how incredibly difficult it was. So I used to have students do it here, and I'd say, with the exception of, it was just a thought experiment, because if they did, they wouldn't be able to function.
Right.
But that in of itself
very,
is
very
a
telling
pin.
in itself, yes.
But I would say, like, could you, and at the time, the top 5, you have, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and some other one. Can't remember at the time. And very quickly you can say, oh, sure. Well, I won't use Microsoft Office. Okay, fine. Or I'm not going to shop on Amazon. Okay, fine. But here, for example, like any large enterprise, like where is their web hosting done? Amazon, AWS.
That's right.
Or Azure. Or so even these services that basically the point of it is as she sort of drilled down through her day, realizing how incredibly difficult and nearly impossible without sophisticated assistance of people setting up like basically custom servers to handle some of these things for her daily routines, that you almost cannot remove
you can't escape
the influence of these companies. And while originally you might think, okay, that's just productized, infrastructure. You become reliant on a certain platform for whether it's Google Docs or Microsoft or Pages or whatever. Sure, you can find alternatives to that. But then you start thinking, as we move this progression forward, again, what is that subtle influence that is being placed upon all of us without our, awareness of it.
It's just become part of the infrastructure of our lives.
Absolutely. The fabric of...
That's right. So one of the things that fascinates me about this is, so you've got these big tech companies that are effectively creating boundaries for the stories that define our lives. And it's more than boundaries. It's almost like sort of threads and roads that we follow, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You've got to have that sort of social infrastructure, that intellectual infrastructure, and that creative infrastructure in society to keep us together.
Yeah.
But it also begs the question, how do you break away from that? Or how do you even begin to modify it? What are the techniques? So actually you go back to your idea of, you see something sort of bright and shiny in technology. Yeah. Take a step back and take a week to think about it. Are there other analogies to that with living in a technological world where you've got these big companies sort of steering us? Are there ways of either temporarily stepping out of it or beginning to co-opt some of this so we can go in different directions? Are there techniques of beginning to separate ourselves? And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about how I interact with technology. So take a very seemingly trivial example. Even though I live in a technological world, I love manual things that aren't connected. Yeah. I love the feel of a real book. And there's something special about reading a real book, which is not connected to the internet. Yep. I love manual controls on things, knobs that you physically turn. I mean, it seems very trivial, but there are ways in my life where I take joy in the things that aren't directly controlled by digital corporations.
Yeah, yeah. Although Are you
now going to rip the carpet from underneath my feet?
Well, we won't take maybe the best thing, we won't take a saw to the branch that we're sitting on on that one. But no, I mean, I agree. I feel like, and while you were talking, in my mind, I'm like, it's like, and people have tried this. I mean, there's campaigns at times for people to do. I don't like the term detox because the terminology is messy.
It's really messy because it really isn't toxic. It's part of the fabric of our lives.
Yeah. And also, I mean, the reminder too. I mean, we live now in an age where we have different types of stimulation, both interpersonal. That has changed dramatically. You can, regardless of how you feel about it, it's changed, right? And they've changed in ways that our brains, our brains and the way we process these things is a very slow. It's the result of a very slow process with respectively very slow change until now.
Right.
And so there's also this disconnect of, when you feel fuzzy and weird about these things when they're moving, like that's also perhaps an evolutionary trait to be cautious of change,
that's
right?
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Hey, this new creature showed up. It's a big fuzzy lion looking guy. Let's
Right.
Should we let him into the camp?
Those risk instincts start kicking in.
Yeah, they start kicking in. But so I'm thinking all these things, and and a lot of online sources are advocating for people to change their social media behaviors, especially if you're recognizing negative impacts. But I can't. It's been brought up several different times through different courses, different things here and there, just in my own life, and I come back to this this idea too of having whatever you want to call it, maybe negative space of having the opportunity to be away from things, to return internally and to think and explore these kind of pieces. Because I think there is this, and again, we can put blame where it either is deserved or we just cast, right? In terms of it must be more, hurry, do. And in an advanced digital life that we have, rarely in that is built-in opportunities for reflection, to slow down. It doesn't mean you can't engage in the latest and greatest tool or platform or whatever, but it's about creating that intentional space.
Finding that balance.
Balance. And there's a Dutch word for it. It's
It's always a Dutch word.
Always, and there's always good German words too. There's a lot of good German words for things. But the Dutch word is Nixon. In it, you can look. I mean, I'll post it so people can dig it. But it's essentially the practice of doing nothing.
Right.
Like intentionally finding that space where you're not doing it. And so as a parent of two small kids, they're never bored. Like they don't understand what boredom is.
Right.
And I'm like, and that's a loss, I feel like.
So you realize this podcast episode title has got to be The Art of Doing Nothing.
The Art of Doing Nothing. I like it. Show title.
Right.
I love it.
But no, this is, to me, so important. And this is actually central to a lot of what I've done over the years professionally.
Yeah.
Understood that it's really important to have that space where you are doing nothing. It's a chance to sort of reset, rethink, sort of stretch your imagination, be sparked by new ideas.
Yep.
But it's increasingly hard to do, not only because everything is clamoring for your attention, but the expectation is you're doing things. So even professionally, the pressure to always be producing and always be producing more completely negates that idea of sitting around being bored.
Yeah.
And yet if you don't have those spaces, it's like sleep.
Yeah.
And if you don't have sleep, you go a little crazy.
Right. I mean, your brain starts literally starting to choke on itself because it can't
that's right.
clear out the bad
So
bits.
the analogy, I suspect, and I'm a little outside of my expertise here, but I suspect that there's an importance in having those spaces where you're either bored or you just have that time when you're doing nothing for a mental and a creative reset.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say coming from the creative side, it is a like carefully crafted. What people can get. All right, let me back up my word salad here. As I'm turning into it's a word blender. I'm blah, 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 blah. Too many ideas jamming at the traffic jam at Sean's mouth.
Yes.
But from a creative space, that place of boredom is, in some ways, is a very protected, like sanctuary of space in some ways. And people who are can be really good at engineering their parts of their life to specifically allow for that, because, and this is, again, cognitively and stuff. This is outside of my wheelhouse as well. But more anecdotally. That space of boredom, you allow your mind to wander into places where you don't otherwise let it, because it's under this intense stimuli of you got to produce this, you got to make a blog post, now you got to do this thing, now you got to record that thing, now you got to write this, now you got to go here, now you got to go here, that you don't have an opportunity to just slow down and stop. That creative space, that boredom allows for us to think and become inspired by the things that we've been hustling or the things that we notice.
Right.
I mean, that old saying of like, slow down and smell the roses, right? It's like, stop your rush.
So this is stuff actually we know. And
we know this as humans.
You look at all of the stuff around techniques to do this, whether it's sort of meditation, yoga, whatever. And I would say very, very clearly here, I do not think there is one way to do this.
No.
For some people, something like meditation works. For other people, just creating that space in their own unique way is important.
Or like...
But yes, people talk about this all the time. And yet I've got to say something here. One of the things that worries me is this whole approach to creating space becomes part of the hustle culture.
Yeah.
Because you're told, carve out 30 minutes for this, 30 minutes for that, 30 minutes for another way of finding space. And it just becomes part of the pressure to do stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, I see calendars from time, and my own included, that are, from start to stop, they're all the way through. And I've had times where I look at that, right? And you're like, well, when am I supposed to think?
Right.
If you're in meetings, for example, right? Like whatever your profession, however you're doing, right? Whatever you're in, if you're from start to stop, or from sun up to sundown,
right.
You're crammed in these things. Where is the time for you to actually think?
I know. And of course, I'm thinking, so we're now at this period in an academic institution where we're writing our annual reviews and saying all of the wonderful things we've been doing. It probably wouldn't go down too well if you sort of say, well, this last year, I thought. My deliverable is brain power thinking.
But and I would say, regardless of your profession, that is truly an important part, because that's where. But it is funny. That reminds me. There's a line out of the Big Bang Theory TV show, or I think it's one of the main characters, Leonard. He's talking about his day. He's like, he's asked, "What did you do today?" He's like, I thought about stuff.
Yep.
And the person looks at him like, are you out of your mind? He goes, well, I wrote some of it down. And I'm like, it's funny, but I will say.
It's very real, yeah.
But that part is, and one of the things that I worry about, and again, even just myself reflectively, when I feel that I've been swept up in the rush, go, is I feel a loss of that, where I'm like, wait a minute, where's the time to just think about these things? Because that's where those new ideas tend to come from, where you're like, whoa, this is the excitement comes from those discoveries and those ideas, not from just, people find their fulfillment however they do.
Right. Yep.
But I think, and we, again, as humans, we've known how to do this. I think the issue now is we have to protect it way more than we've ever had to in the past.
I think so. And an example of that, and this is going to be deeply controversial.
Sure, let's do it.
You look at research, especially here in the US, but I think this happens elsewhere. There is such a pressure to get grants written and submitted, to get money in, to do stuff that leads to publications, that there is no time at all to think. And if you try and carve out that time to think, it is frowned upon. As a result, you look at research outputs and creative outputs. Yes, you see research that is advancing incrementally, and yet the really creative stuff, the step change stuff, doesn't work if you're just hustling to do more and more, faster and faster. It only works when you step back and find the time to cogitate and think and be inspired serendipitously by things that are unexpected.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'll just add my weight behind that. Like, we'll make it controversial. That's fine.
Right.
Because again, I think that is also in some ways, that's the industrialization of a thinking profession. Right.
Yes.
We're only going to measure based on quantity of output.
Right.
And that kind of brings me back to another issue that I've been having thinking about these things too, is not all problems need to be quantified and solved as a mechanistic issue.
I don't think they can be, actually.
I would 100%. In fact, I would lump that right into broadly these sort of alignment problems with, and we'll stay away from the AI words, but the alignment problem of a technology-based, top-down technology-based solution, right?
Right.
This difference between sort of deductive solution versus an abductive, this idea of like, we take a top-down approach. If this is this way, then this other thing must be that way. This is true.
Yep.
It's too strict. It's overly thinking. Versus an abductive, which is, essentially constantly refining a hypothesis of is it like this? If not, okay, maybe it's like this. So somewhere in the middle is more appropriate. But this was brought to my attention too in a very simple way of there was I forget the name of the exact it was a railroad project. And it was, I think, getting people from London to Paris via the rail system. And it was this massive spend.
How long ago was this?
It's probably like 5-10 years ago.
Oh, okay, right. So it's post the Channel Tunnel.
Yes.
I was just about to say there's a little bit of water in the way, but yeah.
Total aside, I am fascinated by people who can dig tunnels underwater. Okay, but so the idea was, or at least I'll butcher the facts here, but the premise is the same. Is that essentially the issue was, well, how do we get to increase people's satisfaction? How do we get this train to get from point A to point B faster?
Yeah.
And it took millions and tens of millions of dollars of infrastructure. And in the result, it's like 3.5 minutes faster. Right.
Yes. Yep.
Versus the thing was like, well, again, you're trying to quantify the problem here. What if you just made without changing how long it takes, just change the quality of the experience.
Right. Yes.
So instead of putting gazillions of dollars into making a faster train, better rails, different sized tunnels, whatever it was, whatever the infrastructure aimed to fix, to again get a very minimal sort of output that ultimately probably didn't change anybody's day, because you just would get you just get accustomed to it and then complain.
Right.
It still takes too long. They were like, why not give everyone free hot cocoa, or play music, or give free Wi-Fi, or whatever it is. But the idea was the solution did not lie in a technical, deterministic solution that you could figure out by, well, the only way to make people happier is by making the trip shorter. And
this is the problem when you really rely on fast outputs. You basically say, we don't want you to think about this. We just want you to do. As soon as you do, you cannot see the full solution space. They're not even really solutions in a lot of cases, but the full pathway forward space. You are very, very narrow. And as a result, you almost definitely do not come up with the optimal way forwards.
Yeah. I mean, what's okay. I can never get this right. What's the phrase? If all the world's a nail if you're a hammer. Is that right? Is it the other way around?
I can't remember now, but effectively it's if all you've got's a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think, I mean, this applies, I think, directly to a lot of the big tech companies, especially in like this hyper modern era right now, is if you have success in one way of doing things, or you have advancements and, hey, this was great, let's do this to everything. That you might even take back up and take an argument that all of the innovation that Silicon Valley has represented is in many ways doing that. Applying the things that were successful in those,
that's right. You push it forward. So there's there's a weird analogy here, which is almost definitely wrong, and I'm almost definitely going to regret this. But it's the analogy between conventional computing and quantum computing. So conventional computing is a little bit like the hammer. We've got a way of doing things. We're just going to make that hammer bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's still a hammer. So you get any sort of problem in front of you.
Scale is the only way to tackle
get a problem in front of you. You work out how to use this very, very linear, limited approach to solving it. Quantum computing says, let's take a completely different approach to solving problems. And it's a multi-parallel approach, which is completely different to that linear approach that we have with digital computing. And that's why people are so excited about quantum computers being able to solve or find the minimum in a solution space in ways that conventional computing can't. Now, you bring that back to how we work as humans. You can argue that, again, talking about sort of technology and the story we've been told about technology innovation, we are stuck in a rut where we have a huge metaphorical technological hammer, and that hammer basically sort of says, we don't want you to think more, we just want you to build a bigger hammer to solve the problems in front of us.
We need a bigger hammer.
Whereas actually, sort of, if you look at the human mind individually as well as sort of in a community, the human mind is brilliant at solving problems in unexpected and serendipitous ways. There's a very slight analogy there with quantum computing in that we can see the solution space in multiple dimensions and miraculously come up with ideas that you can't find just with a linear progression.
Right.
Only if we have the time to do that. If we basically say, forget using your brain in the way that it is really good at solving problems and instead follow this formula, we won't see the full solution space. And that to me brings us back to that absolute need for space to play and to think and do nothing and to be bored and be inspired.
Yeah, no, I really like that analogy as well, because I mean, I think you did a great job of presenting that, because it's that probability space, right?
Yeah, and that's it. Yes,
and if you think about, I mean, you can have a lot of fun with that. Of course, the quantum bits and the Schrodinger, and everything's in this state of superposition, and you can't tell what it is until you measure it and all that. But I think that does serve as a really great metaphor for also, again, when we think about how complex every moment is within our own perspectives, right? And, and we've talked about this before too, like there is no way to tell, which I think is fascinating, by the way, with all the technologies that we have. You and I are sitting a couple feet, we're arm's length away from each other. I have no way of actually telling what's going on in your side, in your mind. The only way we can do that.
I'm sitting here thinking, what's for lunch today? I've got this thing this afternoon. Oh yeah, Sean's here in front of me.
And I just realized too, I'm like, if people are watching, I'm like, yes, I am wearing 2 jackets. Right. But I find it fascinating that the only way for me to tell what's going on in your mind, right? Your brain, we can use imaging to see.
Right, yes.
But in terms of your mind, the only way is through the mechanisms of communication. What are you thinking about?
Or
you can tell
art.
Me. Or
yes,
art.
Yes, yeah. It's the way we express ourselves. Yes.
And that's it. That's this expression. And it comes in such a multifaceted, I think about like this sphere of possibility, right? Like how do we tell what someone is thinking or feeling or challenging, or how can you distill a complex life experience in terms of like the emotional components to these, that it's this sphere of experiences, and the expression of that can be done in so many ways, through talking, through art, through nonverbal communication, or this beautiful weird mix of all of it at once. And that is something which, again, that is something that I think we need to find ways to ensure that is not scrapped.
I absolutely agree. And actually just thinking about in it in the context of that, does life imitate art or vice versa? It's all mushed together.
Yeah.
Because if you think about sort of the way you express your life is through art writ large, and that incorporates everything that we do creatively, and that in turn inspires others and becomes part of their life.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can separate out the two.
No, and I think that's. I mean, I think it's a perfectly a correct way.
Right.
If we're assigning, if we're assigning it, it's a correct.
Yeah. And you can see it at multiple levels.
Absolutely.
So for instance, and if you look at science fiction, absolutely, we know that the imagination that you see in science fiction inspires technologists to do things, and that in turn inspires science fiction writers, so vice versa.
Yep, exactly. I mean, in looking just shortly at, the history of science fiction on TV, for example, I mean, people will often, why do we talk to our phones the way we, they talk to communicators on Star Trek or whatever, right?
But I've got to say here, so there are some frustrations here. So there's this whole idea, and if you were talking in intellectual academic terms, you'd talk about an imaginary of going to Mars and living on Mars. How many science fiction writers are to blame for that?
Yeah, true. All of the 1950s and 60s, I think, right?
Yes.
Heinlein's there's a,
I know,
yes,
yeah.
There's a price to pay here, man.
So that's definitely life desperately trying to imitate art, and I'm not quite sure how far we'll get.
Yeah. Well, and, that alone just brings up a thought too. It's like, also to what extent? Right. So, you can paint these pictures of, what it would be like to discover other entire alien civilizations on Mars. And then, as imaging got better, we realized, those cracks are not roads.
Right.
They're in fact
all canals. Yes.
Yeah. They're not like but it was fun to imagine these worlds. And that has a tremendous value because a stranger in a new land and you show up and it's like,
there we are. Yes.
This wild, but also the representation, like that is, when you think about it, right, that is the projection of what has happened in life into this art form.
It's a mirror to our lives and souls. Yes.
It's a mirror. And these are those expressions. And then, we see that and we say, well, it's to Mars is the benchmark. We have to, to colonize Mars for some reason.
Okay. So this actually gets us into really interesting but weird territory. So you can look at that interaction of inspiration from science fiction. So yes, look at those early stories about sort of the potential of life on Mars and actually living on Mars. And actually, I'm reading a John Wyndham short story at the moment, which is exactly that, sort of talking about going along these canals. And you can understand how that becomes a metaphor for how we understand ourselves and think about ourselves in relationship to the future. It doesn't have to be true.
Yeah.
It just has to be seen in the right context of storytelling and how it inspires us. The danger is where somebody has got so little imagination that they take a story that is meant to inspire and sort of stretch our imagination as something that is a real possibility.
Yeah. Or a predefined possibility.
Or a predefined possibility. Yeah. So it's great to be inspired to go to somewhere like Mars. I worry about the lack of imagination in the interpretation of those stories, though.
Absolutely. Well, and that's kind of like this layer of at what cost do you are you imitating that?
Yeah.
Because when you quickly realize, there's like 1/3 gravity. There's no breathable atmosphere.
It's a great place to die.
There's a lot of show titles floating around here.
Yes.
You had mentioned one about having regret, and I was like, the art of doing nothing, regret, great place to die.
Right? Yes. Please do come back next week.
But that's a lot of truth to that, right?
Yep.
Like, there's a reason It's not a hospitable place. Humans as we have evolved here on Earth cannot live on Mars.
Unless we transform it into something that's more like Earth.
Which would take, fine, sure. That does sort of bring us into this idea of what's the responsibility of the human race to provide legacy, right?
That's it. Yes.
One asteroid that we don't see coming could spell the end.
Right.
And so is there an obligation to sort of spread out the odds, right? So maybe, I don't know.
Goodness, that opens a whole can of worms. Then so this also fascinates me because this is part of the story. It is, what is the purpose of humanity? What is the destiny of humanity? What is it that we're striving to build in the future? Is it just the human race continuing? Is it the human race flourishing? Is it the extension of intelligence, whatever that looks like?
Yeah.
And that's absolutely something people talk about. Or do we have a responsibility to the galaxy and the universe? No matter sort of what comes out, is a good outcome humanity no longer existing, but some legacy of what we did persisting on? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good, that might be a good existential question.
Right, I know. But I think it's really important, even in this context of what does it mean to be human?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if we're thinking about being inspired by art and technology and the stories people tell, the question is, where are we going? Where do we want to go in the long distant future?
Yeah.
And how do we need to start thinking about getting there? And how do we even talk about sort of what is the right direction versus what might not be the right direction?
Yeah, absolutely. And even, I mean, there's been a lot of interesting conversation about going back all the way to Voyager, right? With this first, because that was the first, if I'm correct, the first like human-made object that contained, the golden record and the plaque. That basically was like, I mean, in some ways, I think it's very rudimentary, but sort of showing a location in the Milky Way where we assume we are.
And it's such a beautiful thing. It's so naive and beautifully naive because it basically sort of says, this is who we are. This is humanity. This is where we live. These are all the things that are deep and dear to us and that we value from our music and our art and everything. And I love that. It makes me feel warm and cozy and nostalgic for a different time.
And then here's where the sci-fi cynic in me is like, somewhere some alien is looking at this being like soft, squishy meat bags.
That's right.
Like, we know where we're going next, which is, of course, again, our own projection of humanity on that, right?
That's like, exactly it. Yes.
This fear of any
whose story is being told here.
I mean, we do this all the time without thinking about when we say the real threat, because there's a pushback also with sending messages currently, right? And I feel like there's I heard somewhere that there's supposed to be anyway, like an official channel of approval to send messages into basically like deep space.
Interesting.
Because of this issue of like, don't tell them we're here, because if anyone knows we're here, we're doomed.
They're gonna national security.
They're gonna suck up all of our oxygen or whatever, and I don't know, who knows. They're gonna terraform us into, they're gonna do to us what we plan to do to Mars or something.
So if you're thinking about going out there with your laser pointer and sort of putting some Morse out there,
that's right.
Don't do it. You're gonna have the Secret Service or whatever.
That's right. Whatever. If there is whatever intelligence is out there, they're like, that's where we're. But even that comment alone is bringing our own story to that what humans do to other humans, and this legacy, this age-old legacy of conquest and why do we have that? Why is that a deep-rooted fear of us from some other potential life form or whatever? It's because that is the story that we have told over and over and over again here. And so we cannot almost help bringing that story to even that.
That's it. Yep. And again, you go back to where we started with art. I mean, this is where art as a form of connection and communication and inspiration begins to craft and inform those stories. Although interestingly, and I'm interested to see what you think about this, if I look at the literature certainly that I read, there feels like a lot in there, and this is sort of fictional literature, a lot in there which tries to capture the darker sides of humanity and tries to warn us against sort of basing our stories on the dark side rather than sort of what you might consider to be a more humane side.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether this is a direction that a lot of literature goes in or whether it's just the stuff I read. Is there another big body that basically says, embrace the selfishness, embrace the power?
I can't think of. I'm sure someone, and please let us know if you're listening out there and you're like, you guys, what are you talking about? Yes. You've missed the whole thing.
The world domination genre.
I feel like, as like the irony is we'd be talking about this and it'd be right behind us on a bookshelf. I'm like, I don't know any of these.
But again, it's an aspect of art and storytelling. These are the stories we collectively tell ourselves, and then it's really intriguing to see how they then translate into who we are and how we behave and act.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has come up in a conversation or a panel somewhere about talking about the over prevalence of the dystopian narrative, right?
Yes. Yep.
And the concern, the issue that, because they're enjoyable.
Yeah.
Because, as always, for various reasons,
right?
You've done a good job of really going through a lot of those. As well,
it's for the same reason why people watch true crime or sort of crime procedurals. We like to be reminded of where we don't want to be and go.
And then there's hope with like there's the what will happen if you scrap everything, the possibility, right?
That's right. Yes.
And I think a lot of people may not even recognize that that's what they're most interested in is in all these scenarios, there's a catastrophe of some sort. Otherwise, it's not dystopian. And what a lot of people are drawn to is the self-reflection of how they would fare in that scenario the opportunity. What if society went away? How would I, in the zombie apocalypse, how would I fare?
Right.
Let's hope we never find out. But there is a concern that I have too of, again, when that is a predominant form, that it becomes this slow scale over time of being overly pessimistic.
And that's how people think. And again, it comes up with this question of, is life then imitating art? If we tell a lot of dystopian stories, do people start thinking that the future is going to be bad?
Yep. Or creating a desire for let's burn it all down.
Right. Yes.
Because, because that I've fantasized about these scenarios and therefore, I'm taking pleasure in the chaos or the destruction because of this idea that I have about where I might go or what might be next. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and I think that's an important piece of trying to also call back, what is the other side of that? What are these things and not just perpetuating these stories of caution, but perpetuating stories and perhaps creating new opportunities and stories for possibilities, right?
And actually, to be fair, and I'm just going to stick with literature again, you look at the vast range of stories out there. There are a lot of really positive, really reflective pieces of art, pieces of literature out there. So it's a little dangerous to sort of just focus on the dystopian stuff. But at the same time, I'm intrigued to know who reads these, who the audience are, who reads the majority of the dystopian stories, and how that then affects thinking across the world and across society.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that.
And of course, that extent, and this is something that's bothered me for a long time. You look at sort of TV shows and movies, and I love going to movies, but you've got to wonder how much those movies influence how people think. And the research is murky. There are no sort of clear sort of causal relationships. But if you see enough movies where there are subtle messages about sort of the state of the world, I've got to believe it's got to wheedle its way into sort of how we think about ourselves in relationship to the world in some way.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely gets complex, right? With a lot of media theory pieces in there in terms of that. But I think, even anecdotally, I think people, if you ask yourself, do I get influenced by these things? And then I would say the answer is yes. The question is, to what extent?
Really complex. So
it's very complex.
Take an example. There's been a lot of research over the years about violence in movies and how that affects behavior. And most of the research, to my knowledge, last time I looked, is there is no link. You watch a violent movie, it doesn't lead you to carry out violent acts. On the other hand, the tone and the underlying story of a movie, I think, can change how you think about the world. So you can have violent movies that give you a very healthy view of the world. But on the other hand, depending on how the narrative is subtly shifted, you can see violent movies which actually make you think in ways that are unhealth about your relationship to the world.
Absolutely. And I mean, it comes back to, again, I'll evoke the story. That comes back to the story and how the world can, if you use it this way, the world is a very violent place.
Yes.
Right? Watch a nature documentary
right
with your 4-year-old and tell me it's not a violent place.
Yes.
But it's the way the violence is used as what?
That's exactly.
Is it a glorified? Is it a glorified? That is the goal.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's
or is
glorified?
it a salutary tale? Yes.
Or is it part of the story? There are violence can be used as in a non-prolific way of trying to entice violence, right? Because that's not the idea.
Yep.
But as a catalyst for storytelling, something happens. It can be a consequence of decision. And so I mean, I grew up again in the 90s. I lived the whole violent video games
right.
are going to create an entire generation of violent humans.
Yep.
Those of us who play the game are like, what are you talking about?
Wait till we get to the Secret Life of Sean, then we may have to rethink that. But
well, if you see, there is a truth to that. If you see the games and the things I play, you're like, oh my goodness,
did you
and you're like, oh
did?
yeah, like it's fine. There's
right.
But yeah, I mean, it's. I'll come back to this idea. It is incredibly complex, incredibly. I really like that metaphor you sort of painted of this, like the quantum state of
right. Yes,
I really enjoyed that.
Sort of finding those minima and those sort of seeing the bigger landscape in multiple dimensions.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, so this has been a weird and wonderful journey.
This is what happens when we say we're not talking about AI.
And actually, apart from the beginning, we hardly ever did talk about AI.
I got really close. I have to be honest. There was a few times I'm like, I'm going to do it.
So I'm going to wrap up and get back to AI, because then with all of this, with all of the wonderful messiness of storytelling from multiple perspectives and how it influences us, what happens when AI takes over the narrative and starts feeding us the stories? Yep. Where does that lead us as humans?
Yep. And that's the real fear. That's the big concern of who's telling that story.
Who's telling the story? Yes.
So you'll have to tune in next time to hear.
Or sometime in the future.
Sometime in the future, Well, Andrew, thank you. This is, again, I love these conversations, and I'm so glad we were able to find, there's so much to talk about, but it was the challenge. I enjoyed the challenge today of like, we got to talk about this stuff without talking directly about AI.
We didn't do too badly.
We didn't do too bad. But again, you can't talk about anything without it being somewhere hovering on the periphery. And that alone is something to be very aware of.
I think so. Yep.
Well, fantastic. Well, I will put as much of the stories and the bits that we talked about, I'll just cram those into the show notes to share. But yeah, this is fantastic. And
we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on Modem Futura.
Demodulating signal.
Modem Futura is a production of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. To learn more about the Future of Being Human initiative and all of our other projects, please visit us on the web at futureofbeinghuman.asu.edu.
End transmission.